Well, welcome everyone this evening. It's great to see everyone being so punctual, not lingering at the bar for too long. There'll be plenty of time for that later. We're delighted to have so many of you here for the Fall of the Wall session this evening. My name's Murray Jack from Deloitte. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to organise our speakers and the discussion that we'll have following their brief presentations as well. It is 25 years to the day since the wall came down, and that's a quarter of a century, quite a long time. I think that means the wall's been down almost as long as it was up, if I'm not mistaken, which kind of puts it in perspective a little bit. But it was a seminal time. It did mark, I guess, the end, or at least the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and obviously the unification of Germany. And with the war went all the certainties that existed when we had the Cold War. And we've kind of flummoxed around as a world since then, with a lot more uncertainty than we had prior to that time. And our speakers this evening are going to explore some of those uncertainties. Privileged to have three speakers this evening. They'll each lead off and speak for around 10 minutes. That was the instruction. Of course, we all know that speakers have a proclivity for talking longer than they're instructed. So we'll give them a little bit of a warning bell at 10 minutes if that's required. But we do have a little bit of flexibility. And then we'll have time for questions and answers and discussion after that. Leading off will be Dr. Oliver Hartwich, the Executive Director of New Zealand Institute. New Zealand Initiative. Well known to all of you, which is no surprise. He's settled in very well in that role. And as a board member, I can attest that we're very pleased with the work that he's doing on our behalf. Oliver's going to describe the event a little, some of the post-fall impacts, and the relevance of that to the GFC where we find ourselves today. He's going to be followed by His Excellency Zbigniew Gniatkowski, who's the Ambassador of the Republic of Poland. In his past life, he was a TV and radio journalist, so we look forward to that perspective. But more recently, European Commission representation in Warsaw, Deputy Head of Representation, Head of Press and Media. So we certainly look forward to his perspectives on what's happened. The Cold War has ended, but has a new one begun more recently, given some of the issues that are occupying the minds of those in the east of Europe today. And he'll be followed by Dr. Jason Young, New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre at Victoria University. Jason conducting research projects on the New Zealand-China relationship, with particular focus as it has on Fonterra's dairy farming initiatives in China, which is a separate topic in itself, which we probably won't cover tonight. But Oliver was telling me that the Chinese have been great studies of the war, its fall, and the aftermath of that fall. And you might recall that Tiananmen Square, the events of that particular time, occurred in the same period as the fall of the war. And there's a degree of nervousness amongst the Chinese leadership what actually happens when you have civil disturbance on that scale. So the lessons for the Chinese leadership, and I imagine other things will be covered by Jason as well. So let's lead off now with those introductions with Oliver.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you, Deloitte, for hosting us tonight. I find it really hard to believe that it's already 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. In many ways, to me at least, it feels like yesterday, which is probably because it was such a surprising, joyful, and emotional event. Every time I watch pictures and videos of that time, it still gives me goosebumps. In November 1989, I was a teenager in West Germany, and just like practically everybody else, I was glued to the television. In all honesty, despite all political rhetoric about striving for Germany's eventual reunification, hardly any of us believed it would ever happen. Only a couple of years earlier, an opinion poll had revealed that 97% of all West Germans did not believe it to be a realistic prospect. In hindsight, of course, there are 1,000 good reasons why the wall had to fall and the Soviet bloc had to crumble. Yes, Eastern Europe was economically bankrupt, and there was a strengthening democracy movement in many Soviet bloc countries, particularly in Poland. However, the brutal perfection with which the wall separated Berlin made it appear permanent and insurmountable, quite literally. It was almost impossible to imagine that this ghastly border could one day just disappear, let alone disappear peacefully. I had visited East Berlin in 1988, just for a day's excursion on a holiday trip to West Berlin, and I'm really grateful for this experience. East Berlin was supposed to be the showroom of East German socialism, but it was really just one drab, poor city. Apart from the feeling of being kept under close police surveillance wherever we went, there seemed to be uniformed people on every corner, my most vivid memory is one of colorlessness. Well, actually, that's not quite right. There were colors, but they were all shades of beige and gray. If you remember 1980s fashion and design in the West, it was full of bold colors and patterns, and looking at old pictures, I often ask myself, did we really wear that? Life in the West was colorful, prosperous, and affluent. And this made the contrast with East Berlin even stronger. East Berlin looked like a city from which anything lively had been sucked. No billboards, no street artists, nothing creative, no joy, and no colors. This deeply unappealing state of affairs of East Germany was, of course, the reason why the Berlin Wall had been erected in August 1961. Prior to the Berlin Wall, more and more East Germans were leaving behind oppression and misery for a better life in the West. And in order to prevent the East German state from bleeding out, the East German government then closed the border. First with barbed wire and improvised brickwork. Then with a technology that turned the whole of East Germany into one big prison. Watchtowers, spring guns, tank traps, guard dogs, and landmines made the German border an almost impenetrable barrier. Since the Berlin Wall had been built in August 1961, at least 255 people had died trying to cross it. Another 617 people were killed along the 1,378 kilometers of the German border and the Baltic Sea. Most of the victims were shot, many drowned, and some bled to death. When we commemorate the events of the 9th of November 1989, our first thought should be with these victims of the war. They died not because they had committed any crimes. They died because they were yearning for a better life. They died because they wanted to be free. We should not forget the other victims of the East German regime. The people whose lives were ruined by the secret police, the Stasi, whose ambitions were thwarted because they did not conform to the communist ideology, who were imprisoned, tortured, and killed for their beliefs. The 9th of November signaled the end of such suffering. It quite literally opened the gates to a new life for millions of East Germans. This is why we are celebrating the anniversary of the fall of the wall today. It was one of history's most visible triumphs of liberty over oppression. It marked the disappearance of one of the most brutal and inhumane political systems the world had ever seen. It was one of history's rare moments of unbelievable luck, an unexpected blessing, a miracle. You do not have to be German to feel that the fall of the Berlin Wall is a very special event in world history. Its significance, well, extends beyond Germany, because it also marks the end of the Cold War confrontation, which had dominated geopolitics since the end of World War II. It also stands for the end of Soviet communism, even though the Soviet Union only formally disbanded a couple of years later. So there are many reasons to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall. Unfortunately, the great triumph of liberty in November 1989 did not always translate into a better future, not for Germany itself and not for Europe either. Germany could have seized the chance of reunification to reinvent itself, to really take that liberal spirit of the 1989 revolutionaries on to build a better, freer country. It did not happen. Instead, reunification saw the extension of the old and already ailing West German welfare state to the east. Helmut Kohl, the West German Chancellor, deserves full credit for ensuring Germany's smooth reunification, which was undoubtedly a difficult and challenging process. Kohl had to negotiate the conditions of reunification not only between the two Germanys, but also with the Allied forces of World War II. To manage all of that within less than a year, unification was completed on the 3rd of October 1990, must be regarded as a diplomatic masterpiece. Kohl's economic strategy, however, did not work out. It is debatable whether he even had a strategy to manage the economic transition, or whether it was just wishful thinking. Kohl promised the East a rapid catch-up with the West, and he promised the West that supporting the East would not cost a thing. In the end, he failed on both promises. You can see how Kohl's economic management of East German unification failed by comparing the economic performance of East Germany and, say, Poland. Polish growth rates have been much stronger since the fall of communism, and that is despite Poland not having enjoyed the luxury of transfers from a richer neighbor in the West. Since unification, West Germany has transferred subsidies to the East equivalent to about the total of Germany's public debt. Despite these vast transfers, East Germany is still poorer than Germany's western states. Economically speaking, Germany's reunification was an unmitigated disaster. But it's not just Germany that feels the negative side effects of a mishandled process of unification. In some ways, the whole of Europe is now paying the price for Germany's unification. I'm talking about Europe's monetary union. You may now wonder what one has to do with the other. Where's the link between the opening of the Brandenburg Gate and the introduction of the euro? But even though it may not be immediately visible, there is such a link. Without the fall of the Berlin Wall and Germany's reunification, there would not have been monetary union in Europe. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, there was enormous suspicion in other European capitals about the prospect of a new, united and stronger Germany. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was particularly horrified, if you remember. "We beat the Germans twice and now they're back," she allegedly told a meeting of European leaders at the time. French suspicions of the rise of a new evil German superstate were equally strong, as previously confidential memos now released by the British Foreign Office reveal. President Mitterrand was convinced that the prospect of unification had turned the Germans into the bad Germans they used to be. He saw them as behaving brutally in the pursuit of their new national interests, thereby upsetting the political and security settings of Europe. In a conversation with the then US President George Bush Sr., he also remarked, "I like Germany so much, I think there should be two of them." The tensions between Germany and its neighbors around the time of unification were enormous. Even the Soviet Union was more open to the idea than West Germany's old allies, the idea of unification. France especially needed to be convinced that it had nothing to fear from a reunited Germany. Germany's neighbors got their reassurance. There's now good evidence to suggest that in return for a French oui on unification, Germany had to sacrifice its Deutschmark and agree to European monetary union. The euro was the price Germany had to pay for national unity. As we can see now, the euro has achieved the opposite of what the French had hoped for. It did not weaken Germany, but strengthen its position in Europe. Most deplorably, however, the euro has become the millstone around the European economy's neck. It is one of the main reasons why Europe's economy is not developing anymore. Europe would have been far better served with its previous diversity of currencies, but in order to alleviate fears of a German dominance post-unification, Germany had to give up the Deutschmark. That's one of the least recognized and yet worst results of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But to come back to the more positive reasons we are here today. The fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened 25 years ago, was a fantastic event. It was one of history's great and uplifting moments. I've been back to Berlin many times since my first visit in 1988, and every time I feel this buzz when I'm freely walking the streets of East Berlin, when I walk through the previously closed Brandenburg Gate or go to Potsdamer Platz, a shopping center in the former no man's land. I could not be happier about this historic achievement, and I'm proud I chipped my own few pieces of the Berlin Wall away with a hammer and a chisel on a visit to Berlin in February 1990. However, I'm saddened that the great liberal revolution of 1989 did not have a more lasting impact on Germany, and I'm afraid that the introduction of the euro, which was a result of German unification, did more harm than good to Europe's economy. For tonight, however, let's just rejoice in the miracle of freedom that happened in Berlin in 1989. To quote John F. Kennedy, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was, civis Romanus sum. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, ich bin ein Berliner.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to thank you for organizing this meeting, which is a very important issue also in Poland. We will celebrate this 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but of course on different occasions we highlight the Polish input into this process in the Central Eastern Europe. On the 18th of January 1989, the General Secretary of the German Socialist Union Party, Erich Honecker, speaking of the Berlin Wall, he said, "It will continue to stand for 50, even 100 years, so long as there are reasons for its existence." In 1989, that part of Europe which lay to the west of the Iron Curtain became a stage for an extraordinary experiment. Within a short period of time, several nations were standing on the threshold of a chance to change their fate, an event almost unprecedented in history. The pace of the year 1989 was extraordinarily intensive, as though the whole breakthrough in freedom for Eastern and Central Europe had to take place within the space of that year. In January, the pending changes to the system were little more than a glimmer of hope. By December, the new independent order was a reality in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. At the same time, in the German Democratic Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, and the Baltic republics of the USSR, the vision of changes to the existing system were already deeply rooted. For Poland, the end of the year, which brought about the restitution of the free emblem of the state and the traditional name of the country, provided a sure sign of a return to independence. That's why we celebrate 25th anniversary of our independence. Each half of that year had its own specific dynamics, which were diametrically opposite. The first half saw the waning of the communist system, but with all its main characteristics. The arrogance and brutality of the authorities, as in East Germany, as you mentioned, Czechoslovakia, or in Soviet Georgia, economic catastrophe, public apathy, and a general feeling of hopelessness. Spring belonged to the Poles, summer to the Hungarians and to the Baltic chain. Autumn belonged to the Germans, so the fall of the Berlin Wall could happen, Czechs, Slovaks and Bulgarians. In the early days of the winter, even the Romanians felt the breakthrough. On the 4th of June 1989, the day when a European nation, the Polish nation, won a victory over the communist authorities, rebellious Chinese students were massacred in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. There, when faced with a threat, the communists didn't hesitate to resort to violence. In the countries which have undergone a democratic transformation and which eventually joined the European Union, a return to communism after 25 years seems impossible. If everyone in Europe lived as we do in a stable democratic world, a return to the beginning of this quarter century would not be so very important. However, in Ukraine, the year 2014 is a reminder that not all of Europe changed after 1989. Coming back to the beginning of this decade, we would like to show a broader perspective and the series of events which conducted to the fall of the Berlin Wall. When the Polish Pope John Paul II visited Poland on a pilgrimage in June 1979, he was greeted by crowds numbering millions, crowds which had discovered that it was possible to organize themselves despite the communist authorities. The words uttered by the Pope in Warsaw, "May the Spirit descend on us and change the face of the world, this world," were treated not as a challenge, but as a prediction. In the summer of 1980, hopeless in the face of a growing wave of strikes, Polish communists undertook negotiations with workers, leaders in the coastal province, and agreed to the main demand, the creation of an independent trade union movement. The multi-million strong Solidarność Union, Solidarity movement, which came into being in September 1980, became a widespread social movement, and Poland experienced freedom on a scale hitherto unprecedented in the Soviet bloc. So that was almost 10 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Finally, the introduction of the martial law on the 30th of December 1981 and the internment of thousands of opposition members, the prison of democratic reforms, served only to reveal the weakness of the communists. Solidarność was legalized, and yet tens of thousands of people joined the ranks of its underground structures. The democratic societies of the West supported this independent underground movement. Also, the support was organized in New Zealand. Lech Wałęsa, Nobel Peace Prize laureate in 1983, was treated as an official representative of Polish cause, like Aung San Suu Kyi nowadays. By the middle of the 1980s, signs of the thaw began to emerge from Moscow. After an amnesty announced in September 1986, the Polish authorities ceased to arrest people on political grounds. Solidarność began to rebuild its open structures, and the strikes in the spring and summer of 1988 made it clear to the authorities that social and economic stagnation was beginning to pose a threat to the stability of the system. The communists showed finally signs of readiness for dialogue. They were, of course, encouraged in this by the challenges in the USSR, Glasnost, Perestroika, which were rejected by those in power in East Germany, criticized by Ceausescu in Romania, or treated with considerable reservation in Bulgaria. The Polish opposition, which had been organizing itself as a civic committee since December 1988, under the leadership of Solidarność and Lech Wałęsa, and headed by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Bronisław Geremek, decided to enter into concrete talks with the reformatory wing of the Polish Communist Party and to provide it with cautious support. At this moment, a round table started in Warsaw, plenary discussions between the opposition and the government. Lech Wałęsa, in his speech during the inauguration of the round table talks, said that our efforts were and still are wasted. Rates of pay are poor. Nothing is as it should be. This results from a bad system, from a lack of freedom. We can still feel Stalin breathing down our necks. This cannot go on. It must change. Poland must be a fit place to live, and Poles must feel that they are in charge. After 2 months of negotiations, the round-table talks in Warsaw come to an end, and a final agreement is signed. And the main result of these negotiations is quasi-free parliamentary election. First free elections in the area dominated by the Soviet Union in the last 45 years. Later on, the Solidarity movement was registered again, and another series of events could happen. But at the same time, in the middle of May, in China, in Beijing, 300,000 demonstrators demand reinstatement of full civic rights. A student delegation meets with members of the Chinese Communist Party and puts forward its demands. On the 4th of June, during the first round of parliamentary elections in Poland, 62% of those entitled to vote take part, and the opposition wins hands down, gaining 160 of the 161 seats in the Sejm allocated as a result of the round table agreements. And the opposition wins 92 seats out of 100 in the Senate. During this first round of parliamentary elections, this victory is really tremendous. Lech Wałęsa said at this time, the elections were a chance to create an interim system which would be a meaningful bridgehead for the coming victorious battle. We were aware that what was happening was a test for several generations of Poles, and that by the following morning, Poland would be a different country. By participating and voting for our own candidates, we were opting for reforms, but without a loss of blood. And yet the scenario could have been completely different. And as a development, you will probably elaborate on this in China or even in other countries in our region could be really different. On the 12th of September 1989, Prime Minister Tadeusz Mazowiecki, speaking in the Sejm, so the Polish first fully democratically elected Prime Minister Mazowiecki, said, "We reject the political philosophy that economic reforms can be introduced without reference to the wishes of society, putting aside democratic changes. Only a society of free citizens and the policies of a government which has the trust of the decided majority can be instrumental in Poland's recovery." The Sejm unanimously approves the new government. The breakup of the Soviet bloc changed the political and economic face of Europe. On the 7th of February 1992, in Maastricht, a European community was transformed into the European Union with a common currency, European citizenship, and joint foreign policy and joint security policies. From January 1990, radical changes began also to take place in Poland. The Polish United Workers' Party ceased to exist, the Communist Party. The Solidarność camp broke up into several warring factions. Mazowiecki's government applied shock therapy to the Polish economy. Next year we will commemorate the Balcerowicz's plan and painful reform program, which conducted to the success of our economy today. It triggered an explosion of entrepreneurship amongst Polish citizens and introduced an economic rationale. All the countries in the region, which just 2 decades previously had been embedded in a civilizational and economic nightmare supporting the interests of the Soviet Union, now achieved a historical success. They became full and equal partners in the United Common Europe, members of NATO and the European Union, built on a foundation of respect for human rights and freedom, on principles of democracy and the right of nations to self-determination. Thank you for your attention.
As the Republic of Poland, Chairman of Deloitte, Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As mentioned in my introduction, my focus of my research is China. And so I've therefore been asked to speak tonight on whether the lessons of the past, namely the fall of the wall, apply to events in Asia today. And certainly they do. China is a country that modelled much of its early post-Civil War political-economic system on the Soviet Union. It established a Leninist party state led by a Communist Party with Marxist ideology at the centre and socialist transformation as the goal. China set up a planned economy with many commonalities with the Soviet planned economy, including a strong focus on heavy industries, service, employment and rationing provision by the state, and central planning that dictated production targets and output. Communist China was isolated and had an antagonistic relationship with the democracies during the Cold War. China traded little with Western economies, people exchanges were few,
and little information flowed between China and the free world. The early years of the People's Republic of China, therefore, had much commonality with the systems that abruptly ended in Eastern Europe and today's Russia with the fall of the wall. However, when the wall came down in 1989, China had already embarked upon a radical reform project that has transformed China's own domestic environment as well as reshaped China's engagement with the world. It is the current and future outcomes of this transformation, commonly described in shorthand as reform and opening, that distinguishes China from the Soviet Union of the 1980s, and it is this China that we should focus on to draw lessons from the fall of the wall in Asia. Let's consider the reform side of the ledger first. China is a civilizational state that is constantly reinventing itself. It is one that for most of the last century struggled with the modern world and the evolving global market economy. This period of China's modern history is marked by heavy reliance on the state to push through some successful and many incredibly unsuccessful modern state building projects. However, a full decade before the fall of the wall, China embarked on what Barry Norton describes as a dual-tracked transition away from the command economy. In the 1980s, policymakers chose to allow the market track to develop without dismantling the planned economy. As the market track grew to become the main driver of the Chinese economy, a suite of further regulatory reforms, state-owned enterprise privatizations, financial and banking reforms in the 1990s combined the market track and dismantled the command economy. China has since deepened its market reforms. The third plenum in 2013 pushed to, quote, allow market forces to play a decisive role in the economy, end quote, and moved some way to addressing many of the challenges China currently faces. These challenges include liberalizing capital and financial markets, land reform, labor market reform, further privatization of state-owned enterprises, exchange rate liberalization, tackling corruption, and strengthening the rule of law. In short, China's transition toward a market economy is well underway, though by no means complete. China's economic development to date is largely attributed to the dismantling of the command economy and allowing the market to drive China's economic revival. Scholars and policymakers in China are strongly supportive of this shift, and there is a very important consensus that the reforms must continue. This type of economic consensus sits more closely with the post-1989 consensus emerging in Europe than with economic thinking in the Soviet Union before the fall of the wall. Following this domestic comparison, we can also make comparison of today's geopolitical situation and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The first thing to note is that the Cold War in Europe was characterized by the Soviet Union espousing radically different political norms and institutions, mutual distrust, and a fear of Soviet expansionism. Such a characterization is not so easily supplanted in today's Asia. Granted, there is competition and tension in the region, as can be expected with the rise of a new power, but China is not presenting its role in the region as a counter to the open trading and independent economic system established in the post-war years. In fact, China has been and continues to be a major beneficiary of the global market economy and the institutions, norms, and values that support this system. Again, the shift in China began in the 1980s when it opened to the world through special economic zones. These encouraged inward foreign direct investment and the transfer of corporate governance models, technology transfer, and most importantly, they integrated the Chinese market into the existing global market. Today, China is the top exporter and a top importer. It is not only a major recipient of global capital flows, but it is also becoming a major global investor. Chinese businesses and investors are not challenging the existing global market economy, as the Soviet Union and China did previously, but rather becoming major actors within that system. For example, the recent announcement of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is not an ideological challenge to the market system established in the post-war years. Instead, it is the logical extension of that system as new actors gain the means and the capacity to drive new institutional initiatives. If there is a concern, the concern is not with any kind of ideological challenge, but as to the effectiveness and standard of the new institution. Another example is the liberalization and internationalization of the renminbi. Again, China is not putting forward a new model of international exchange, but rather making efforts for the renminbi to be an important currency within the existing system. The most important example, I would argue, is China's stance on free trade in the Asia-Pacific. In 2008, China signaled to the world that it was a supporter of creating an open regional economy when it signed a comprehensive free trade agreement with New Zealand. Recent efforts at APEC to revitalize the proposal to create the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific show China remains committed to this goal. Here we can argue that any tensions created by China's stance on free trade are not created by a radically different view of how the regional economy should be set up, as was very much the challenge from the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but rather from a question of who will lead these initiatives and whether China, as a large but still developing market, will push far enough to support comprehensive 21st century agreements. To draw a conclusion then on what we can learn from the fall of the wall and its impact in Asia, I believe there are two important considerations to pay attention to. The first is that China has already carefully studied the failures of the socialist model they imported from Marx and Lenin, so evident in the collapse of communism in Europe. Today, the models that China looks to for ideas about its own politico-economic development are in the advanced economies of Europe, the Americas, and Asia. While there has been no simple transplantation of these models to China, and a number of conservative stakeholders in China remain opposed to the ongoing reform project, it is these models that are having the largest impact on Chinese development. Secondly, China is engaged in global trade and capital flows. It is a significant actor in the regional value chains, and its people and businesses are deeply intertwined with the global market economy. This distinguishes China from the situation in Europe during the 1980s. But before I finish speaking, I should also note that recent years have seen a more confident China emerge on the global stage, and one that stresses its own political development model, as was referenced in the Tiananmen massacre, where the party very clearly maintained its control of power, but also evident in its own foreign policy interests and its own institutional development to support the market economy. Such a China remains compatible with the global market economy today, but it is one that will require significant and ongoing efforts to further integrate and socialize into the international system. In short, while there are tensions created by China's rise, its new role in the region and large share of the global market, China has achieved these things by transitioning toward a market economy and opening to the world, not by creating an opposing ideological system as the Soviet Union attempted. Therefore, if this trend continues, it is unlikely we will see a fall of the wall moment in China, barring a significant economic downturn or domestic crisis. Instead, we will likely witness the emergence of a large, dynamic market economy that creates the conditions for further political